Another search using ground-penetrating radar has revealed 54 possible unmarked graves on two former residential school sites in eastern Saskatchewan. Kisiku's First Nation believes many images are children. The graves were discovered on the grounds of the Catholic Church-run St. Philip's and Fort Pelly residential schools on the First Nations land near Kamsack. Assembly of First Nations National Chief Rajan suggested last week that Canada lower flags every time a recovery has been made in recognition of the horrors faced by children in residential schools. Well, joining us now to talk more on what else needs to be done is Dr. Winona Wheeler from the Fisher River Cree Nation. She is also an Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Saskatchewan. Dr. Wheeler, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Some very heartbreaking discoveries in Saskatchewan, ma'am. What do we know so far about these 54 grave sites discovered at St. Philip's and Fort Pelly residential schools?
Well, we don't know a whole lot more because the ground is still frozen and there's like 3-4 feet of snow on the ground. So they can't do a whole lot more. But there's another 4 hectares of land that they believe might also have unidentified graves on it that they'll start to look at in the spring when the ground thaws up.
And what has been the provincial and federal response following this recent announcement last week?
Well, it was interesting because for the first time you had the Minister of Indian Affairs, you had the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, and you had the Archbishop from the local Regina Diocese all at the announcement. And that's a first. And so that was a lot of people were, I would just say they were not empowered, they were relieved to see, these 3 authority bodies represented at this time. And in that they saw some hope that maybe there'd be more action taken.
And speaking of authority, I want to go back to Chief Archibald's comments in terms of lowering flags following further discovery of unmarked graves. What would such a move mean to First Nations communities across the country?
Well, basically it's a respectful show of shared mourning and commemoration. It's what we do as a nation when there's been trauma, when there's been loss of lives, and the loss of the lives of these little people has never been commemorated. They've never even had decent burials or being sent back home to their communities. So it's a show of solidarity in many ways, and so some people might think it's symbolic, but it means a little bit more than that.
And I guess one of the bigger questions here would be whether lowering the flag is enough to recognize the horrors of the residential school system.
No, it'll never be enough. I don't know if anything will ever be enough. There's still so much work that has to be done, that making sure that those little bodies make their way back home, for example, making sure the governments are going to be contributing to do DNA testing to make sure that they can identify who they are so they can be sent home to their home communities. There's a whole lot that needs to be done yet. And the reality is that Canadians are just becoming aware of these atrocities. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done educating the public and in this age of reconciliation, trying to find some ways to come together and to help people work through it. Yeah, there's a lot that needs to be done.
Indeed. And in terms of really helping our viewers understand the impact of residential schools, tell us a little bit more about residential schools and the long-term impact they have had on First Nation communities even now.
Well, the residential school system was put into place as part of the federal government's assimilationist policy. And that was their quote-unquote Indian policy for over 100 years. That to make us disappear as Indigenous peoples by assimilating us into the Canadian mainstream. And the way they did that was basically beat the culture and the family connections and the social system out of the kids. And I've had 2 generations of my family, 3 generations of my family, a couple of older cousins went to residential schools. And the first thing they do is they cut off all your hair, right? And then they put you through this process where you're not allowed to speak your language, where Christianity is imposed on you, and rigorous military-like activities going on at the school, like you're all dressed in uniforms, and you got to think about the impact that 3 to 4 generations of people going to residential schools has on the community at large and on families. It's absolutely devastating. So you got 3 or 4 generations of people having it beaten into them, all of these dehumanizing assaults against their persons and against their people. So 3 or 4 generations of people were basically told they were no damn good for nothing, that they were stupid, that they were ugly, that their parents and their grandparents were backwards, heathens, filthy, all these negative attitudes towards Indigenous peoples. And a lot of the stereotypes that still exist today come from that era. And so when you've got 3 or 4 generations that are experiencing this onslaught of negativity, like violent negativity, and you add that ideological, that emotional abuse to the physical abuse, to the sexual abuse, separation from family. And what happens over time, especially with little kids, is that all of that ugliness gets internalized. They start to believe it. And so what happens when you've got 3 or 4 generations of people who have internalized to varying degrees all of this ugliness about themselves, this self-hate, this low self-esteem, lack of confidence, right? It gets internalized and then it manifests, right? It manifests in all sorts of unhealthy and negative ways. So, for example, we got the highest rates of suicide of any sector of Canadian society. We got the highest rates of family breakdown. We got the highest rates of a lot of physical and health issues like diabetes and stuff. We got the highest rates of incarceration of any sector of Canadian society. So these are all manifestations of historical trauma.
It's clear that a lot needs to be done to really handle the recovery following the residential school system. Dr. Wheeler, I wish I could talk more with you, but we are out of time, so we'll definitely have to bring you back on Forum Daily, ma'am. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back.